and the message called, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?" Now, I said earlier that I was in love with Mr. Rogers, and I was only kidding just a little. When I was a kid, I didn't watch Mr. Rogers. When I was a young adult, I didn't watch Mr. Rogers. When I was middle-aged, I didn't love Mr. Rogers. But now that I'm way into being a senior citizen, I love Mr. Rogers. He is not with us anymore. But his spirit is with us. His spirit is with us. And a few words in tribute to this remarkable man is that he knew what it meant to be a neighbor. He knew what it meant to create community, to live in a village. His village, however, was enormous because it was on television. Now, Mr. Rogers lived in Pennsylvania, not all that far away from where we are. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister, but his ministry was his television preaching. His preaching to preschool children and young children. And the gift that he had was that in speaking to them so carefully and so intently with his face right there in the screen, was that he paid attention to them. He paid complete attention to them even though they weren't sitting with him. He explained the world in very simple terms that children could understand. He modeled really great parenting in the sense that, as Linda said at the beginning, when he came into his room, he took off his suit jacket, his symbol of the outside world, and he put on his sweater, his symbol of his inside world. He took off those shoes and he put on his sneakers one at a time, and all the time he was singing as he did it. And so you watched him change from a person who was outside into one who was inside with the kids. Now, Mr. Rogers died a few years ago, not before being recognized for his outstanding achievement in television and his amazing programming. And when he received his Emmy for Lifetime Achievement, I may have told you this story before, he took out his pocket watch at the podium and he asked everyone in the room to sit and listen for a while and to think and reflect on a person in his or her life who had changed the pattern of that person's life. And the television cameras rolled. They rolled over the audience while people were sitting, simply remembering people who had been mentors to them, people who had saved them, people who had helped them. And at the end of the minute, he hit his stopwatch and he said, "Thank you." It still brings me to tears, remembering that, thinking about what he was saying, thinking about how it was not about him, it was about the world around him, and the ways in which we reach out to each other and help each other. Now, these words came to mind. Again, they come to mind several times a year for me because every time I turn on a television or I open a newspaper, I'm reminded of all the ways in which we are cruel to each other, the ways in which we ignore the fact that we are neighbors to one another, the ways in which we, endlessly get into conflict with other people, and how difficult it is for us to get past that incredible urge to be right about things. I actually got out my Webster's Dictionary of the World to look up the definition of neighbor just to see if I was right in what I thought a neighbor was supposed to be. It says, a neighbor is a person who lives near another. The second meaning, a person, country, or thing situated near another. The third, a fellow man. And then it says in parentheses, as in love thy neighbor. And four, any person. In that sense, it's used as a term of address. So I could say to you, good morning, neighbors. It's a form of address in that case, whether I know you personally or not. Now, the story, the love thy neighbor story, I think you all know where that comes from, do you not? It comes from the book of Luke in the New Testament and the story of the Good Samaritan. And I thought I'd read it to you as a reminder of what being a Good Samaritan is all about. I don't ordinarily preach anything related to the Bible, at least not directly related to the Bible, but this is a story that is so classic, it's taken on a life of its own. So Jesus was talking with followers and people who were curious about him. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him. Now, wouldn't you know it was a lawyer? And he said, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you understand the law?" And the lawyer answered and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But the lawyer, wanting to justify himself, of course he's a lawyer, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And this is a big question. Noam Chomsky would say it was a really big question, loaded with multiple layers of interpretation and significance. And so it should be, and so it should be for us too. Then Jesus answered, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. They stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side." Does anybody do that nowadays? "Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw the man, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring out oil and wine. And he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come this way again, I will repay you.' So which of these 3 do you think was the neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" And then he said, that is, the lawyer said, "He who showed mercy on him." And Jesus said, "Yes, go and do likewise." So who was the real neighbor to this man? Was it another Jew? No. Not a Jew as the lawyer understood Judaism. It was a Samaritan. Now, Samaritans share the same ethnic heritage as the Hebrews. They're both descended from Jacob, according to my biblical dictionary. But the Hebrews despised the Samaritans. They despised them because even though they were a Torah-bound tribe of people, they had different ideas about what was sacred and where the sacred places were. And the Hebrews did not like that. Was Samaria far, far away from Judea? No, it was right next to it. They were next-door neighbors. Which brings me to a very thorny subject. How many of you have ever had a neighbor who really annoyed you? Yeah, I see a few hands going up. Yeah. I have a neighbor who doesn't annoy me, but he annoys my other neighbor. And my other neighbor talks to me constantly about it. I said, "Why don't you just go talk to him?" I'm not going to fix this for you. You need to go talk to him. Now, the Samaritan, by the laws of the Hebrews, did not count as a neighbor. They were shunned by the people that Jesus tended to minister to. But Jesus had no problem stretching all the boundaries around being with other people. If you've read the New Testament or you've heard stories from it, you know that he spoke to everyone who was off limits to so-called observant Jews. He spoke to women that he was not related to. Hello. He touched people who were ill. Hello. He cared for them. Hello. He raised the dead. Ooh, hello. Yes, now, I don't know if he raised them physically, but he certainly raised them metaphorically. He had a gift for lifting the spirits of other people. And you could interpret that in many different ways, because spirit, of course, refers to the breath of life in that person, as well as what's going on in that person's soul or emotions or heart. Now, we live in a society that's increasingly and incredibly strongly focused on the rights of the individual. Because we are not so heavily tribal in everything we do, we often go through a lot of distancing ourselves from other people. I don't think it's meant with any ill intent, it's just the way we have become. We don't want all of our neighbors to know everything about us, do we? Do any of you have neighbors who know all about you? I live in a very small town. And for the first 6 years in the town, I only knew one person, my next door neighbor. It wasn't that I was shy, although I am shy when I'm not at a microphone. It was that I worked in New York City, and I got on a bus at 5:30 in the morning, and I didn't get home till 7:30 at night. There was no way I was going to meet my neighbors unless they came to my house. And one neighbor did, and that's why I knew him. Now, I told some of you that a tree fell on my house during Superstorm Sandy, and it buried my house. And do you know that now that I've lived in my house for 26 years, only one neighbor came to my house to see if I was all right? Now, I understand that people are worried. You know, they've got their own concerns. We were all sitting without power and all the rest of it. But my house was the only one in that whole neighborhood that got hit like that. And thinking about it now, I look back on it and I think, maybe I have not been neighborly enough to my neighbors. Maybe I need to go seek them out, have a little chat with them, invite them over for tea or an open house on New Year's Day, and see what happens. Maybe they felt that they didn't know me. Maybe they were intimidated by all those Unitarian things on my front porch. All the flags. The UN flag that's right here in front. I don't know. But I noticed that even though I know their names, I bet you that most of them do not know mine. Now, I see a lot of people wearing name tags today, and not all of them are congregational name tags. So that makes me wonder if you all know the names of every other person in this room. Do you? Okay, so right now I want you to stand up and say hello to someone you have never spoken to before in this room. Just get up, say hello. You don't have to get into a long conversation. Tell them what your name is. Has everyone spoken to at least one other person?
Hi, John, have you got your paper ready to read?
Paper?
Whatever you're going to
I
read.
may read a scene from.
Have you considered the point here? Yes? One of the reasons I'm so aware of this is that I also teach in a community college. And every time a new semester begins, I have to ask my students to introduce themselves to one another and to actually work together in pairs and triplets and quadruplets. And I make them change where they sit, not when they come into the room, but once the class gets going, because they seem like isolated eggs in an egg box. James, you know what I'm talking about. When you're in a city, you tend to feel like, you're a little nervous about all the interaction and all the people all around you, sort of like an egg that might hit another egg and they both get cracked. But when you're in a place like this, and when you're in a classroom, you have to get past that. You have to get into the fact that you're in a community setting. You're there together to be and do and feel together. So I make my students make name tags that they put on the front of their desk. They have to keep them there for a month. I quiz them on names to see who knows who else is there. And they're like, I can't believe she's doing that. But last year, at the end of the course I taught on research writing, I asked the students what they had gotten out of the class. And one girl's hand went right up and she said, do you know, you're the only teacher I've had in all the time I've been in this college who knows my name. And I thought to myself, this is not unusual. This is widespread, the fact that we don't learn each other's name. And yet the name is the first step, in a way, in getting deeper into knowing who your neighbor is, knowing who's sitting there. I want to share with you a story from the New York Times. You may have seen it. It was in the September 29th magazine section. I called her the anorexic biker. My sisters and I didn't know the woman's name. But for years, we saw her riding on our street in Washington, grinding up the hill past our house, then coasting down to Massachusetts Avenue, then beginning the same climb again. She would go up and down our street for at least an hour every day. And mind you, none of them knew this woman's name. She was out there in all kinds of weather, always wearing headphones and a backpack, often chewing gum. She didn't live in our neighborhood. We figured she picked our street for its degree of incline. Sometimes we saw her riding around in other parts of Washington, D.C. We learned to spot her ponytail and particular grit from far away. I was in high school when we first started seeing her. She looked to be in her 40s and was dangerously thin, so I assumed, perhaps incorrectly, that her punishing schedule was connected to an eating disorder. Anorexic biker was an unkind moniker, but I'd had my own issues with disordered eating. She became a fixture in our lives, though we never talked to her. My sisters and I went off to college, but when we came home for the holidays, the biker was still there. We had to admire her discipline. When we stuffed ourselves on Thanksgiving turkey, she was out burning calories. While we retreated into air conditioning on scorching summer days, she was sweating hard. Her obsessive presence became routine. And so it shouldn't have surprised me that she was there 8 years ago on the day that my mother's body was carried out of our house. She had died of cancer at just 60 years old. We'd been preparing for her death for weeks. When her doctor said all treatment options had been exhausted in March of that year, I took an unpaid leave of absence from my job in New York, and I came home. The hospice nurses made daily visits to check her pain levels and adjust her dosages of morphine. My father's sisters and I took turns staying up with my mother at night. She didn't want to lie in bed. She was afraid to sleep, presumably because she knew she might not wake up. And so she insisted that we push her around the second floor of our house in her wheelchair. By then, she was too weak to walk, and on the nights when I was on duty, I begged her to rest. You don't have to sleep. I told her, I'll read to you. I offered to read Alice Munro. She could barely speak, but she shook her head no and made a small circle with her finger in the air. She wanted to keep going. I pushed the wheelchair around and around the house while everyone slept. It was late April when she finally let go. The flowers were in full bloom, and I remember thinking that no one should die on such a beautiful day. My sisters and I were lying in bed holding her when she died. My father called the hospice nurse who phoned the funeral home, and they came to take her away. We followed our mother's body down the stairs and into the hall. We would have given anything to hold on to her for just one more hour. And when they wheeled the gurney out into our front yard, I went with them and suddenly sank to my knees with a primal wail. I couldn't help myself. I was on the grass, sobbing, ready to pull out my hair with grief. The histrionics of Greek tragedy suddenly made sense to me. And then I looked up, and there she was, our very own Sisyphus, the witness to our loss, the audience for my pain. Our eyes met briefly, the biker's and mine. And then she kept riding while the men from the funeral home loaded my mother's body into a van. The next day, I found a card under the front door. To the entire Holt family, the envelope said. It was a letter of condolence from the biker. She was touched, she said, to see our family unite to take care of our mother for the past couple of years, and she was sincerely sorry for our loss. Had she always known our names? Or had we once been stock characters to her? Had she been watching us all those years when we were watching her? I wondered what other moments of human drama she'd glimpsed from the perch of her bicycle seat. What family squabbles had spilled out on the lawn. It was a lovely card. When she came riding up our street that afternoon, I ran outside to meet her. Thank you, I said, finally calling her by her name. So another example of a Samaritan, of a person they saw every single day for years, whose name they had never even asked. Never asked each other, never asked anyone else, but that woman who was unknown to them did know them. And she did the neighborly thing, even though she didn't live in their neighborhood, as the author says at the beginning. She was from someplace else, but she extended herself to them. Stories like this are very touching, and they're disturbing too, because they remind us of the ways in which, we may not do all the things we'd like to do. We're sometimes unaware of the things we didn't do, sometimes discover them long after the time that they would have been useful. But this is a call to learn the names of those we see, to learn each of you, to learn the names of others who are here, who are visiting, and who are here all the time in this room. This is part of what being a neighbor is all about. Now, what does this have to do with the United Nations? I would say it has everything to do with it. The United Nations was founded because countries full of people did not learn each other's names, did not want to know each other's names, did not want to abide by the boundaries of their different countries. The United Nations was founded with a lot of support from various Unitarians, I must say, back in 1945, I believe. And on October 24th, we will mark the occasion of United Nations Day. It was founded by 51 countries committed to maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations among nations, and promoting social progress, better living standards, and human rights. It has 4 main purposes, according to its homepage, and this is what they are. To keep peace throughout the world, to develop friendly relations among nations, to help nations work together to improve the lives of poor people, to conquer hunger, disease, and illiteracy, and to encourage respect for each other's rights and freedoms. And finally, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations to achieve these goals. I like that second one, to develop friendly relations among nations. In other words, to help us all be good neighbors. United Nations Day was celebrated in 1948. It's an occasion to highlight, celebrate, and reflect on the work of the United Nations and its family, and that's what they call it, its family of specialized agencies. Now, we've all been around since 1945, some of us since before 1945, and we know that the United Nations struggles with the tensions in the world, that it has not always been successful, and it has not always been applauded by its members or by those who have not yet become members. And yet, if we don't do anything to help it along or to help each other along, nothing's going to change, is it? It's the only organization we have of that type and that size. Which brings us to the question of how many friends can you have? How many neighbors can you manage to be friendly with? That's an individual question for each of you. Some of you may have lots of friends, acquaintances. If you're on Facebook, you have lots of friends. But are they the same kind of friends as the ones you're sitting with here? Are they the same kind of friends who come to you and to whom you can go when there's trouble, when times are hard? You all know the expression fair weather friend, right? So you must understand the concept of a bad weather friend, even though we don't talk about that term. Which friends do you want? The United Nations is in a very awkward position of trying to negotiate world peace through the bad weather, right? It's the bad weather that comes to the United Nations far more than the good weather. So, as it comes on October 24th, I hope you'll give some time to think about the United Nations. Its charter and the Universal Charter of Human Rights are so close to our own 7 principles listed right there on the wall that it is something we should reflect on. And we should also reflect on its flag and what its flag means. Here is the flag spread across the front. It's the one I hang outside my house on many occasions when others are flying American flags, because I tend to think a lot bigger than just the United States flag. And what I love about this flag is that it is a view of the world that shows no boundaries on it. It does not signify national rule. It does not signify who is part of what. It is a map of the land formations on the earth as they appear from outside. You notice that? And it's very squashed, of course, because it's a flat map. It's not a globe in this sense. It is a powerful reminder of what the world is all about when we don't fight over different territories within it. So I'd like to close with 2 thoughts. One from a Sufi teacher I met 2 weeks ago. When she started the talk that she gave about Sufism and Shiism and Sunnism and all the isms within Islamism, she put her hands over her head and she said, "Help me this day to overcome my urge to believe that I am superior to others." And I thought, what a beautiful, simple way to put this. Help me to overcome the urge to believe that I am superior to others. It is that conviction, that need to protect our egos, our strengths and our weaknesses that gets us into so much trouble with our neighbors, our close neighbors, our distant neighbors, and those neighbors on the other side of the earth. The feeling that we have to reassure ourselves that we are superior. Once upon a time, I was a member of an Episcopal congregation, and the priest got up in the pulpit one day and he said, "I'd like to remind you all that each of you is unique and not one of you is special." And you could hear the whole congregation, whoa. And I thought, unpack that for me. And he did. He said, look, you are as unique as your fingerprints, and you as unique as yours. Each of us is unique. And not one of us is more special than anyone else. So, Help me to overcome my urge to think, to believe that I am superior to others. This is a lesson worth considering, especially if we are going to be each other's neighbors. Here endeth my lesson.